All right. Bridge Nation, Bridge Nation. If you hear me, give it that shout for Black cooperation, Black culture, Black power. Bridge Nation, if you are out there, make sure you hit that comment section. This is Michael Tekin Strode with the Ujamaa Hour, bringing you all complex cooperation all the time. I am here to make sure that you understand that there are other ways we can do business. There are other ways that we can define capital. There are other ways that we can think about our political and personal community economies. And I want to show you all of the different ways that we have in order to think through those things and strategize and accomplish some of the goals that we have for our community. So what I want to do tonight is I want to do a bit of a recap of some of the things that we discussed from the last meetup. And then I want to move very quickly into what we're going to be discussing this time around. So last time we were together, we talked a bit about cooperation, and we defined cooperation. We defined cooperatives. Tonight, I'm going to give you some background on a subject that is, near and dear to my heart, which is capital. And I want to make sure that we get through some of those things. So I'm going to be starting here about 5 minutes in. So, if you think it's about another minute and 20 seconds, we'll go ahead and loop everybody in and really start this discussion off strong. This time around, so last time we were together, we talked a bit about cooperation, and we defined cooperation. We defined cooperatives. Tonight, I'm going to give you some background on a subject that is, near and dear to my heart, which is capital. And I want to make sure that we get through some of those things. So I'm going to be starting here about 5 minutes in. So, if you think it's about another minute and 20 seconds, we'll go ahead and loop everybody in and really start this discussion off strong. This time around, so last time we were together, we talked a bit about cooperation, and we defined cooperation. We defined cooperatives. Tonight, I'm going to give you some background on a subject that is, near and dear to my heart, which is capital. And I want to make sure that we get through some of those things. So I'm going to be starting here about 5 minutes in. So, if you think it's about another minute and 20 seconds, we'll go ahead and loop everybody in and really start this discussion off strong. This time around, so last time we were together, we talked a bit about cooperation, and we defined cooperation. We defined cooperatives. Tonight, I'm going to give you some background on a subject that is, near and dear to my heart, which is capital. And I want to make sure. All right. Bridge Nation, we are down to 54 minutes and 22 seconds into our series. So I want to go ahead and kick things off. You saw me dipping out through the office a moment ago there because I realized that I left a very critical part of this broadcast this evening, which is going to be the Neo Green book. If you do not have a copy of your Neo Green book published by the Bridge Embassy, it is highly suggested that you locate one if you can. I'm sure you can, but it has been out since last year. And certainly, there's lots of elements in here that are very critical to us unpacking the subject that we're talking about tonight in terms of our capital, because in here we're going to be discussing one of the subjects this evening, the 8 forms of capital. And so I want to give a view of 8 forms of capital, both from the perspective of Bridge, but also from my work with something called permaculture, which is permanent agriculture. And we'll get into some unpacking of that definition this evening as well. And another one that I've located from the Aspen Institute, whether or not, we subscribe to anything else that might be coming out of there. Certainly they did a series called WealthWorks, which, had a view towards these 8 forms of capital that really subscribe to helping communities to unpack what all of the different assets were inside of their space that they could use to build their community economies, that did not necessarily focus on that single point of financial capital. But before we do that, I just want to say that this is a broadcast, the Ujamaa Hour, sponsored by, of course, the Bridge Embassy for Black America, the Bridge Embassy for Black America, where we build and protect Black. So effectively, we are talking about how we are defining Black autonomy, how we are defining Black economies, and how we are really moving forward and pushing forward in all of the different ways inside of our community to cultivate businesses that do not really, not simply build our individual capacity and our individual wealth, but really build sustainable community wealth that can last for generations. Because ultimately, we recognize that when we build individual wealth can be knocked off very quickly by one financial crisis, by one sort of a swipe at the apple tree, at the roots of our community. As occurred with the housing crisis. But if we start to really think about how we're framing and building community wealth, then ultimately what we're talking about is building something that can stand, that can last for generations, that can fuel institutions, that can really sustain us for the long term. And ultimately, that's what we are seeking to do here in Bridge Embassy for Black America. Build institutions, build communities that can sustain for the long term over many generations. So tonight, again, I said that we're going to be talking about capital, and I just want to define capital for a moment. So the way that I have I've defined capital for many years, is something that I drew from an author called named Charles Eisenstein, who wrote a text called Sacred Economics. And this is not necessarily something that I think is unique to him, but it's certainly something that when I heard it stated of him, that reiterated to me exactly how we should be really thinking about capital, which is in a basic sense, capital is a form of wealth that creates other wealth. And so when we think of capital, I like to think of seeds. And so when we talk about seeds in permaculture, the seed is critical. The seed is to be protected. The seed is to be cultivated. The seed is to not simply be cast about into the soil, but you have to cultivate the space in which you are going to plant your seed. You have to think about the conditions in which you are placing your seed down. And then you really have to protect the entire sort of lifetime or the lifespan of that seed. You have to think about the conditions in which it's growing, how much water you're providing, and what you are ultimately attempting to cultivate from the outcome of that seed. So capital being a form of wealth that creates other wealth, of course, that is a metaphor for natural capital, which again, we're about to get into these 8 forms of capital inside of Bridge. And so when we talk about what capital is and how capital moves, we exist in a community that has access to lots of experiential capital. Capital that we go outside of our community to sell, capital that we go to jobs in order to earn wages from. But how much of that capital are we able to preserve? And so when we talked last week about cooperatives, of course, cooperation, if we define that word cooperation is simply the way that humans ally themselves together to perform actions that have or perform towards goals that are mutually beneficial. So every human society has at some point had to develop a sense of cooperation in order to accomplish the goal of simply, building together, of gathering themselves together to protect themselves from the elements, to protect themselves from what they might have perceived as other enemies outside of their community or outside of their tribe. And ultimately, this sense of cooperation, this sense of gathering together is not something that, we simply do not simply something we do for an emotional return, but it is something that we actually do in order to create and structure ourselves inside of human society. So in terms of thinking about how capital is related to cooperation and how capital is related to cooperatives, cooperatives are a vehicle that our community could potentially be using to preserve some of the wealth that is brought into our communities. So one of the examples that you saw me post in the group this week was about Tight Shift Labor Cooperative out in Washington, D.C. And that was, of course, Juan Reed and Allison Vasile. And when I talk about what preservation looks like inside of a community, when we have individuals who are returning from, stints in prison, and they are looking for opportunity, and they are shut out of spaces where opportunity exists, but we know that they have experiential capital, we know that they have the ability to do work, to do things, but what we generally usher those returning citizens into are simply, wage labor, just the ability to kind of go and sell their labor for a relatively meager return and just kind of accept whatever conditions they can get until they can get back on their feet. When we could potentially be thinking about that as a form of human capital that is returning to us, that is able for us to kind of, build a structure. If we could build structures in our community that they could come into, and then we could understand what their skill sets are, we can understand what talents they are bringing back with them, and then instead of simply saying, go out and pick up whatever wage labor you can find, we said that go out and let's take these talents that you have, let's assemble them together with other human capital, other individuals who are also, similarly impaired in sort of in their job search, and build a cooperative enterprise. A cooperative enterprise that could serve other individuals that are returning, that are also in those circumstances. And what we're doing is not only are we dealing in an aspect of restorative justice, in saying that we are providing a way, a pipeline for people to come back to society and mend themselves from the trauma that they've experienced. We're providing a way for our community to expand its own economy, because certainly we have lots of individuals that are coming out of those circumstances and returning to us. And what is it that we are providing them? How are we provisioning services to them so that we can actually maximize the opportunity that they're able to engage in when they return? So I want to go up to the Neil Green book now, and I'm going to flip to. Let me see what page it's on. If you have a Neil Green book, I'm flipping to page 12 and 13. That's where you will find these 8 forms of capital that I mentioned. And so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of talk through these 8 forms of capital. Spiritual capital. Spiritual and religious practices, beliefs, networks, and institutions that have measurable impact on individuals, communities, and societies. Natural capital, as we mentioned before, that can exist as seeds, that can exist as soil, that can exist as air, all of these elements that exist in our community. And one of the things that I posted to our Coldernut Collaborative page recently was this interview that occurred out in Southeast Chicago recently with what were called on that radio broadcast the Mom Fatales of Southeast Chicago, of the environmental justice movement, and effectively several members of the Southeast Environmental Task Force and Natural Resources Defense Council. We're talking about the impact of Chicago's development on Southeast Chicago and how that's destroying the natural capital. And we really need to think about how that impacts our community, when we do not have green space, when we do not have access to the lakefront in our area, when we have, a dirty and deteriorating Calumet River, and this industrial corridor is treated as sort of the dumping ground of Chicago. How does that affect our communities? How does that affect our development? How does manganese in the water system or lead in the water system affect the development of our children? So natural capital is a critical one that we really need to be thinking about in Chicago at this time. Human capital. So we talked about human capital just now with these returning citizens, when people are coming back, and people who are in our communities who have human capital that potentially they are not maximizing. Entrepreneurship is a scary endeavor. Cooperatives present an opportunity for us to think about how we can shift from the perspective of sort of that individual risk and that individual reward to a shared risk and a shared reward model. Cultural capital, all of the practices that we bring with us from our ancestors, all of the practices that we bring with us historically inside of our communities, all of that cultural capital. And when we talk about the youth, we talk about hip hop. When we talk about the youth, we talk about what urban culture looks like. All of those things are cultural capital. All of these embodiments that exist with us, that people are taking advantage of. People are transforming our cultural capital into their financial capital. And we need to look at that. We need to realize that and see how capital flows between the forms. Social capital, our relationships, our connections, our intersections, and the ways that we are able to maximize these relationships in different ways. Political capital. So, right now we are in a season where we are trying to measure what our political capital is and how impactful, how effective we can utilize our political capital, how effectively we can utilize our influence on the politicians that are in service of our community, in service to our community, whether or not it actually looks like that, right? So political capital, physical capital, all of those things that are the material makeup of the world. So, buildings and cars and, all of these manufactured goods, that is our physical capital. And what does the physical inventory look like in our communities? How are we able to maximize and make use of that physical inventory? So one of the things that I talked about pretty heavily over the weekend, because I was at 3 events. One of those events was an aldermanic breakfast for the 7th Ward, Gregory Mitchell. And one of the things that I was talking about there with the director of my neighborhood association was that there was in our community, there's Jeffrey Mall, which is on 95th and Jeffrey, or the Jeffrey Manor Mall. And in that mall, there used to be an Ace Hardware store. Now, the owners of that Ace Hardware store had aged out of the establishment, and they were looking for someone to take over the business. They couldn't locate a buyer. Now, admittedly, these particular, owners of this hardware store weren't necessarily black, but it didn't really matter to them who they sold to. They just couldn't locate a buyer either within the community or outside of the community. What they did have was they had an employee that had worked there for probably 10 to 12 years. I know that I moved into my house in Jeffrey Manor 10 years ago, and this individual was working at the hardware store then. And certainly he was working at the hardware store on the very last day that it was open. But this individual was not interested in taking ownership of the hardware store. Now, who knows what was the reason for them not wanting to take ownership, but what we examined inside of that conversation was that what are the processes that the community could potentially have taken? What are the steps the community could have taken in order to take that business, take that piece of physical capital into the hands of the community so that it becomes a community-owned establishment. It becomes a community-owned business. And that's one of the things that I am in deeper discussion with my neighborhood association because that entire development is filled with vacant storefronts. And, the discussion with the developer is, look, I came here, I bought this mall, I put all this money in, and I'm not just going to give a storefront away, just because somebody, wants to do some sort of pop-up retail option. I need to recoup my investment. Well, how, again, do we assert control over the physical capital in our communities? How do we utilize it? How do we best appropriate it for our needs? And if necessary, if there's a developer that's incalcitrant, how do we pressure them to really understand that, we're not going to allow you to let this establishment sit vacant because you simply, you want to be incalcitrant, or you want a specific type of entity here, or you're trying to wait until you can attract big box retail, which, as we've seen with Target, hashtag Target ain't local, Target in Southland, in Chatham and Morgan Park, big box retail ain't loyal. It will not be loyal to you. You have no capital invested in it. You have no governance over it. So we might as well start thinking about how we build up the capital of institutions that exist in our community and how we strengthen those institutions, how we multiply those institutions. And for me, I think one of the ways that we multiply those institutions is through cooperative development, is through understanding that we have 8 forms of capital. And you've noticed that I've only named 7. The 8th form of capital, financial capital, is 1/8 of the equation. What are all of the other forms of capital that we could potentially be using in order to develop our communities? Now, I told you I was going to talk about that from the perspective of a few other approaches to the 8 forms of capital. One of those being Appleseed permaculture. They talk about it. I have the abbreviation or the acronym FILMSES. Financial, intellectual, living, material, cultural, experiential, social, spiritual. Again, financial, intellectual, living, material, cultural, experiential, social, and spiritual. So that's how the Appleseed permaculture, defines their 8 forms of capital. And they were looking at that from the perspective of sustainable agriculture and really understanding that when you're dealing with cultivating sustainable agriculture, you're looking at all of the mechanisms that exist on a piece of land, and you're trying to understand how to move those elements around in such a way that it mimics nature, and that you don't have to do additional work in order to maximize the capital that is available to you on that land. So cooperation and capital. Cooperation and capital. That's what we are here to discuss. One of the other things that I wanted to touch upon, if I can, get my notes to actually show up here, was, so last time we talked about our cooperation, we talked about cooperative economics. Of course, cooperative economics being that principle of Kwanzaa, that Ujamaa principle. And oftentimes when we talk about Ujamaa, we are only talking about it from the perspective of consumer culture, being able to support black businesses. What does that look like? What does support look like? How do we show up inside of business? And what are the businesses that we're attempting to develop? What are the principles of those businesses that we are actually engaging with? And that's certainly one of the things that is talked about very richly inside of Bridge Embassy, which is that we have to be able to hold businesses accountable. And when there is a dispute between a business and a consumer, we need some mediation to happen there. And when that mediation occurs, if there's something that the business can change or needs to change to satisfy the community, we need to be able to pressure those businesses to do that, right? Because what we're trying to do is not simply multiply the number of businesses in our community without regard to how they do business. We're trying to multiply the number of principled businesses and business owners who are committed to sustaining the community in a reciprocal way. There's a reciprocal relationship between community and business. And so that's what we actually want to do in terms of thinking about how we cultivate our cooperative economics, our Ujamaa, inside of Bridge. One of the other things that was recapped on this previous discussion was about this Blackonomics gathering in Minneapolis. And again, we're drawing down some of the practices that we see in other places. We're looking for the best ideas. And some of those best ideas exist in the form of Village Financial Cooperative. How do we cultivate financial institutions that are in service of what our needs are, however those needs look? Now, everyone may not agree that that the first product they offer is the New Day loan, but we recognize that predatory lending is a very real issue in our community. So if we recognize that it's a real issue, how do we build an institution that actually addresses that need, that addresses that issue, and does it in a meaningful way, does it in a way that is in conversation with the community, and that is meeting the community where its needs are in order that we can lift the community up progressively. We can step the community up to other types of ways of being, other types of financial endeavors. And so one of the things that I wanted to touch upon this evening was going to be the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, just as an example of sort of what this complex cooperation and best use of capital looks like. Oh, that is not the slide that I was looking to do. Boom, there we are. So the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is an entity that has existed for, as we see, about 50 years there in the South. And it's the culmination of several other endeavors in cooperation that have existed in the South prior. So certainly when we talk about collective courage, and if any of you have either been in attendance at Cooperation for Liberation, or if you will be in attendance in the future, you will hear a lot about collective courage. But what Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimbar talked about was that we have historically used cooperation in our communities in order to serve a number of different dimensions around how our community develops. We've used it to satisfy unmet needs when the market just, wasn't satisfying our demands or wasn't, showing up for us. And so the Federation of Southern Cooperatives has existed in the South as a way to provide technical assistance for the development of other cooperatives of all sorts. There's credit unions there, there's agricultural cooperatives, there's all sorts of ways that cooperation shows up in these communities. And so the Federation of Southern Cooperatives was a way for different smaller grassroots efforts to gather together, to share knowledge, to share insights, to build their capacity together. And so I really want to highlight this example of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives because when I was talking to the director of my neighborhood association, Ujamaa, about that hardware store the other day, she's very interested in making use of all of those vacant storefronts. And she wants to know, what are some strategies that we could utilize in order to activate those spaces? And certainly there's been the pop-up retail ordinance that's been introduced here in Chicago recently. And so that was something that I shared with her. There's a pop-up retail ordinance that has been introduced. What is the potential that, we could take use of that and possibly draw on something like the Ujamaa Collective out of New York as a way that we could, build possibly a consignment entity or, some other structure that would allow multiple businesses to serve in this space. It possibly, would not work in a similar method as, say, the boombox, because, there's not enough foot traffic along that corridor. But there are ways that we could potentially activate that space that could draw in local business owners, that would allow them to cooperatively own and manage that space. But the challenge was, in order to get the tools that we need to really build out an effort like that, we got to go a lot of different places, right? There's no local chamber of commerce. And even if we did, go to a local chamber of commerce, they would probably tell us that one person should own it, right? They would probably tell us that, we should take on, a financier or something like that and, seek to buy it. Just, maybe they might say you could be a joint partnership. But, if you talk to them about cooperation in any way, would they understand that language? The Federation of Southern Cooperatives was really about building that shared narrative, building ways for those institutions to collectively think about how they are cooperating, how they are cultivating and growing their enterprises together. So, how are you thinking about cooperation? What are the things that you could change about how you work personally? What are the things that you could do in order to build more cooperation in your life? And how could you better understand these 8 forms of capital? How could you better utilize these 8 forms of capital in order to build your community in a different way? In order to strengthen and cultivate the capacity of your community to move forward? This is cooperation. Cooperation is complex. Cooperation is necessary. Cooperation is how we build societies. It's how we build communities. And it doesn't stop simply at business. So one of the things that I'm talking about in my ward is I want to help in my ward understand participatory budgeting. I want to help them understand zoning advisory councils. I want to help them understand community land trust. Because ultimately, what we're trying to do here is stimulate the imagination of members of our community. We're trying to stimulate their imaginative capacity so that when they go to reach for a toolkit that will solve the problems in their community, their immediate tool is not a hammer. Or conversely, their immediate tool is not a Walmart or a Target. Their immediate tool is not to locate another Dominick's, which, I'd like to highlight, left South Shore in 2013, because big box ain't loyal. Big retail has no loyalty to you. And so what are the strategies we are using to build businesses, to incubate? That's the word. Incubate businesses directly within our community, directly from our community, that will allow us to have businesses that sustain for the long term, that we can transition into other hands so that they do not close, as that unfortunate Ace Hardware incident displayed, and disappear. And one of the things that was highlighted in the discussion around the Ace Hardware was that when a business closes and the owner doesn't actually have a transition plan to another member of their team, what happens there is not simply that a business is lost. We didn't simply lose a physical establishment. We lost all of that experiential capital. We lost all of that intellectual capital, all of that knowledge about how that business operates, about what are the best practices for that business. That's gone. It's no more. So we want to build cooperation. We want to understand the complexities of capital. And we want to build businesses that will last for the long term. So I want to go ahead and bring in our guest for the evening. Our guest is going to be Renee Hatcher, who is the director of the Business Enterprise Law Clinic. She is a solidarity economy advocate, on fire. And certainly, I'll give her a moment to kind of think more, to help us think more about what solidarity economy looks like and is. And she's a cooperator. She's very thoughtful about the subject of cooperation, and she encourages us to move at the speed of relationships because that is what is necessary to sustain cooperation for the long term. So I'm going to bring Renee Hatcher into the call now. If my computer does not, is that beach ball happening? Just a moment, Renee.
Hello.
Am I stalled on your screen, Renee?
Nope.
Okay. Give me a moment with this piece of tech here. Boom. Okay. Saved from technical difficulty. So back live with Renee Hatcher. Renee, welcome to the Ujamaa Hour.
Thank you for having me. This is
Absolutely.
great.
So why don't you tell us a bit just first about your work and about your approach to cooperatives and cooperation, and perhaps if you have any thoughts about this term capital, the ways that we've used it today, and potentially the ways that you've seen it used, how you think we should maybe approach that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a human rights and a community development lawyer, and that's at least how I like to think about my work. A lot of what I do is work with small businesses, nonprofits, focusing more lately on working with cooperatives, other kinds of solidarity economy enterprises. certain types of social enterprises, right, where people are really trying to rethink the ways in which we build businesses, the way in which we manage businesses together, but also thinking about kind of the collectivity and the well-being of their overall communities in that process. And so I really appreciate that I get to work with folks who want to think about how do we transform our local economy, how do we create new kinds of or new ideas about what a business is, what an enterprise is, and what are kind of the underlying purposes behind it beyond just making money. So I get to do that work from right now from John Marshall Law School. I run a clinic there providing free legal support to nonprofits and small businesses. One of the things I'm really excited about that I've kind of been plugging is that we're currently going through a rebranding and we'll be changing the name from the Business Enterprise Law Clinic to the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Law Clinic, which was really important to me, in part just to, one, claim the work that we've already been doing, but also to signal to folks that there really is at least the legal support to create new types of businesses and to support all of the, I think, really wonderful and imaginative work that's already happening in the city of Chicago. So, I started my practice just working with small businesses, mostly on the south and west side of Chicago at the Chicago Lawyers Committee. And after a while, started to do some reflection around, like, at least what were the limitations of that work. And most of the businesses that we were working with, as a sole owner, they in some cases were perhaps like transitioning or trying to think about starting their own business because the 9-to-5 wasn't working for them, or they wanted to just have more independence, I think. And I started to think a lot about like what the limitations of that model is. Essentially, if everybody's going to start their own business, one, there's only so many services and certain kinds of products that we need in any given neighborhood at one time. But then more importantly, really, what's the connection to community and how are these businesses going to be grounded? And I think that, as you've been talking about, the cooperative model is simply a different kind of community engagement. It's a different level of accountability, in part because it's a number of people coming together and governing a business and managing a business together, right? And it also provides, I think, a certain level of just social support, right? Social support in starting a business typically is a long process. And then also just in thinking about, and we'll love to talk more about the different forms of capital, but also, starting a business as a cooperative, you are already engaging so many people in terms of just stakeholders that can come in, and maybe one individual doesn't necessarily have the startup capital to start a particular venture, but a number of people coming together and putting in small pots of money, right, and a collective venture also, I think, can help to disperse like the risk of the business, but also ensure that there's really just, again, a strong network of support as you continue to grow the business, particularly at the outset. But as you've been saying, and I'm sure as you mentioned in the last segment, a cooperative has so many additional benefits. And I think in thinking through the different forms of capital, right, the 8 forms of capital, right, a cooperative so often embodies that in the sense that is drawing, for example, of the experience and the wealth of knowledge that so many different people bring, or the different perspectives that people bring, or the different skill sets, right? And so you see within the cooperative structure, I think a lot more, for example, skill sharing, or you see the kinds of then social networks that are created just by becoming a member of a cooperative or being a worker owner at a cooperative, right? The kinds of deep and thick relationships that are built as people really are building trust and governing a business together. And, the other point that I also wanted to make is this wonderful point that you made, is that we're just not trying to create more businesses. We have to think about how are these businesses going to be accountable to the people that they serve, the communities that they occupy, what is that going to look like? What are some things that we want to demand, right? Of, of businesses, in the way that we want to also kind of set rules in terms of how we engage and build with each other. Businesses can have a huge impact on the way that communities develop, flourish, or the ways in which people are cut off, and don't necessarily have access. So I think that, again, cooperative development, solidarity economy, and thinking about how do we develop the solidarity economy in the Black community, right, is crucial in really figuring out how do we want to reimagine our own neighborhoods, how do we want to remake them. And I think cooperative development is one way in which we can move towards that.
Excellent, excellent. So I am, of course, a co-facilitator with Joan Federo of the Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group. And one of the things that, Joan is very keen on stressing, whenever we are talking about planning and moving forward with things, is the skill building component. So I'd like to maybe draw on your knowledge about what are the sort of skill sets and things that we might need to be thinking about building up if we're actually going to stimulate, a cooperative momentum inside of our community.
Well, so I think a couple of things, right? I think first and foremost, right? I was talking to some folks not too long ago, and I kind of posed this question. It's like, so what do we do when the steel mills close and the paycheck just isn't enough? Like, right, how do we sustain ourselves when, big box stores pack up shop, or, post-industrial business X goes overseas, and the kinds of jobs now that a lot of people, or generally the economy, is producing simply just is not enough to actually sustain, right, a life of dignity. So what do we do in those situations, right? And the thing that sustains us is our relationships. So more than anything else, like, the key to me, even beyond thinking about the skill sets that are necessary to actually build these kinds of enterprises, right, is us building deep relationships and authentic relationships with each other. And in doing that, we put ourselves in the right place to actually think about how do we build enterprises that sustain the kinds of lives and provide the kinds of things that we need. And how do we do that in a collective way that's accountable to community and based in community? And so to me, like, first and foremost is organizing, is relationship building. It's trying to figure out how do we actually think about doing that and making that kind of commitment, and also thinking about transforming ourselves as we try to transform, the local economy, and doing some of this work. In terms of skills beyond that, what I would say is that so much of it is, and this might sound, this is very true from what I've seen in terms of just cooperative businesses. So much of it is, right, really the skill set of cooperating, really the skill set of not only building those deep, thick relationships, but then figuring out how do we go about making decisions on a consensus model, or how do we want to move through certain and tough decisions, right? If, when times get tough in a particular business, or in the first couple of years when you're trying to get your business and push it into the black, like, how do you think about what that contingency plan is, but how do you actually exercise and lead with solidarity of all the members that are involved, and how you do that more than anything else. And then beyond that, in terms of skill sharing, so for example, I absolutely don't think that anyone needs to have, you can run a successful business and not necessarily go to school to be in business, right? And I think that there are a couple of things that might be useful. And one, just understanding, the operating expenses of the business, and what, understanding either the services that you're providing or the products that you're selling and the target markets, right? But I think a lot of that really is and can be built within our communities, and in part, if we're building community economies, the folks who are members and based in those communities have the best understanding of what the needs are, what the gaps are, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, cooperative development, thinking about really grassroots enterprise development is um, is a more successful model, in part because the people that are building these enterprises are the same folks who actually need access to these services or to these products and understand, like, and also understand the culture. And so what I've seen in my experience, a lot of the incubation of these new kinds of cooperatives or solidarity economy enterprises, particularly in the Black community, right? It's almost an organizing effort that's really coming out of culture and also coming out of the deeper understanding of residents who live in a particular neighborhood that know, yeah, we don't have childcare here, so let's start a childcare cooperative, or or we need more or less a culturally kind of solid catering company here, and trying to figure out how we can engage that business in not only maybe having a storefront, but also catering kinds of events or family events or resident events in the community. And so I think in a lot of ways, the skills really come from the actual building of the business. And what I say is that in terms of just, I usually provide the legal support, right? The legal support is certainly not even one of the most important parts of the business. Like, absolutely. And I am of the philosophy that we can come in and teach folks like the basics of, kind of the legal basis that they need to know to run their business, that you don't necessarily constantly need to consult a lawyer. But that's not necessarily the most important part. Of course, we want to make sure that you're on a good footing and understand the regulations in your particular industry. But at the same time, the core of it is really making sure that people can make decisions together, can operate from just a different kind of philosophy and a framework of solidarity and trying to build their business. And then in doing that, making sure that they, are being accountable to community. But the flip side of that is that, in building those relationships, people want to engage your business. People want to find ways in which to collaborate and support each other. And that can mean the world of difference in terms of either being successful 5 years out or not necessarily, sustaining the business after 5 years. Mm-hmm. So I would say there are many skills, but the biggest skill set really is building relationships with people and organizing and making decisions together in a way that is only going to further the ultimate goal, which hopefully is cooperation, but collective kind of thriving of the members of a particular enterprise or initiative or cooperative.
All right. And so, when we first connected, through Joan and just kind of decided to kind of take conversations further. I bumped into on your wall, and you can tell me if this discussion needs not go further, but you're from a Black political dynasty, am I understanding?
I wasn't expecting you to say that, Michael. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm really proud of that. So my father, Richard Hatcher, was was the first Black mayor of a major city in the United States.
That was a discussion whether or not he was or wasn't, right?
He was.
Yeah.
I mean, he was. He got elected as the mayor of Gary at the same time that Carl Stokes got elected as the mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. And I think what more or less what that looked like, my father was elected first. Carl Stokes was sworn in. He was elected afterwards, but sworn in first. But beyond that, he was very involved with the civil rights movement. He was the founding board president of Trans-Africa. He was, very active in the national political campaign, well, when Jesse Jackson ran for president. But more importantly, just as someone who's committed to Black liberation and, Black political power. And so absolutely very proud of, his accomplishments. And in some ways, I like to think that in some way, the work that I'm doing is a continuation of a lot of the things that he was trying to do and thinking about Black political power and how do we exercise that in the current democratic system that we have, but then also thinking about the limitations of that, particularly if we're not necessarily trying to democratize the economy, not also thinking about Black economic power, but in the collective sense, not necessarily just in terms of creating a few more Black millionaires. Right. And I think, that speaks to generally how do we create or how do we transform not only our political system, but our economic system to ensure that we're improving people's lives. Right. And that making sure that everyone, has access to what they need and can live a dignified life in this country.
Absolutely. And so to that point, how do we, I mean, in this sort of tumultuous political season, how do we think about how politics will impact our ability to do the work that we are thinking about doing around, cooperative economy and solidarity economy and the development of these structures that will sustain our community? How does politics impact that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the reasons I love my work in part is because so much of it is really reimagining what currently is and people building institutions, right, that actually they control and that serve their needs, right? And I think that there's something very attractive about that in the sense that we know historically Black folks have largely been left out of so many of the state-run or government programs in different ways, or have not had the same kind of access or experienced both oppression but consistent discrimination from the state, even in the different kinds of opportunities that are afforded, right, by the government. And so I think there's something very, important to me and Black folks having the right to self-determination in this country and building sovereign institutions that kind of serve their needs that they control is one way in which to do that. But the other side of that is at some point you gotta deal with the state, right? And we've seen, and that is a lesson that we have to learn from history. You talked about the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, right? We know that they experienced discrimination in terms of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or just in the ways in which they were treated by local government and trying to actually build and grow, right, Black farmers and the opportunities that they had in the South, and continue to, that continues to be an issue. There was a whole round of litigation about this in terms of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. But example after example, we know, and that's also one of the lessons from collective courage and looking at the historical past of Black cooperative development, there was always a backlash. And a lot of times that backlash was at least implicated the state, if not was directly coming from the state in some instances. And so that at some point we're going to have to deal with the state. So that constantly has to be a part of our strategy. And that doesn't necessarily mean just engaging in electoral politics, but also thinking about what the landscape looks like and what are some of the ways in which we need to neutralize the state to accomplish some of the things that we need to accomplish, or in what ways do we need to build and leverage power to direct the state to do the things that we need, and reimagining and building out a larger vision. And so it's not a either or. Certainly for me, it's a both and it's just thinking about how do we link those two things. And so I see that time and time again, right? And I think that's very prevalent in terms of the conversations between police violence and economic state violence, right? And in thinking about the kinds of experiences that Black folks have in this country, one of the main examples that constantly I come back to is like the experience of Freddie Gray when he was murdered by the cops in Baltimore, right? Not many people know that he was also, suffered from lead poisoning because of lead paint that plagued a whole host of black low-income neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore that went unaddressed by the city of Baltimore, the housing development, right? And the ways in which environmental racism really was killing him at the point that he encountered those police officers that ultimately killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which black life is threatened, that we have to make those connections and also incorporate those kinds of learnings into our organizing work and in thinking about not only how do we build the institutions that we need, but also how do we organize and navigate electoral power or state power in ways that are going to sustain us and actually help us build the world we're trying to build.
Absolutely, absolutely, and to the point about what we faced, in the course of building these cooperative endeavors. One of the most poignant moments for me that came out of the Cooperation for Liberation study and working group was when one of our members, Renee, at the end of our course of, reading through Collective Courage, we were just doing sort of a recap and a reflection period, and I certainly, think this is safe. In fact, no, we shared this in our recap video, so I'm sure that she's okay with me sharing it. But, she talked about being just very devastated about understanding, do we ever win, right? Is it just, is it possible? Like, what Dr. Nimbar talks about in there is brutal. And certainly the history of black people in America is brutal. And the history of black folks globally is brutal. But, what does it look like? Do we ever win? And what happened in the room at that moment was very much, what you're talking about in the course of cultivating relationships. We had spent, 7 weeks kind of, running through this text. So in that room, people pulled together in the course of that conversation. And what happened was a round robin occurred. And in that round robin, it was, what is it that you do to ground yourself when it seems like we are at that very moment as devastated as we will ever be? And, I say this for, all the youth, who felt like that Trump was an apocalyptic president. And, I talk about, Bush 2 was an apocalyptic president. And I remember when Bush 1 was an apocalyptic president. So I mean, Clinton was an apocalyptic president, so
Right.
yes. So I'm certainly, very, very heartened by the discussion around what relationships mean and how critical they are to this work and sustaining us as we do this work, which, can at moments be diminishing.
Yes. No, I completely agree. And that also comes back to your point of thinking beyond financial capital, right? Thinking about all the different forms of capital. But, more importantly, again, I think the at the core of so much of this is really, and all we have when everything else falls away, or when any one of us gets in a tough spot, right, are our relationships and the people that we build relationships with, and thinking about how do we do that and leverage those in a way that will collectively lead us a little bit closer to liberation, right?
Indeed, indeed. Well, if you will stay on with me for a moment, I just want to announce that we are this Sunday hosting another session of Cooperation for Liberation that's going to be at the Breathing Room, 1434 West 51st Street from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. All of those notes will be posted within BEBA. And this Sunday, what we'll be focusing on is the forum and the report back. So we'll be hosting a co-op forum and report back. You see that ballot there, Republican, Democrat, or the people. We hope that you are voting with the third option. So again, we're at the Breathing Room space, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., 1434 West 51st Street. And that will be posted very shortly in BEBA. And are there any sort of last words that you want to, share with us and think reflections that we might think on as we move on from this discussion we've had today?
Let's see. So one, I just want to thank you for doing this. I mean, I think this is fantastic, and actually starting a dialogue about how do we think about, not only just building Black economic power on the individual level, but how do we build it collectively? And then, I want to encourage folks just to plug in, right? To plug into the Cooperation for Liberation group, to think about, even in the context of their larger work or some of the organizing work that they're currently doing, whether it's around economic transformation or not, or Black economic power generally, think about how it plays out in every part, right, of society, and thinking about how the current economic system does simply not work for the majority of Black folks. And once you arrive at that, it's like, well, what are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. And there's so many different ways in which I think we can start to transform ourselves to think differently about our role as consumers, about our role as workers, about our role as just engaged and members of community and just with our folk, and how we might operate differently based upon that. And so I would just encourage folks to keep exploring, to keep pushing, to try to find ways to stay grounded and do self-care as we deal with all of this, as we're inundated with sometimes what feels like overwhelming bad news, right? How important it is really for us to not give up and to sustain each other and actually, support each other as we continue to try to at least change a little bit of the world.
Absolutely. All received and transmitted. I want to, we are 3 minutes past, and I'm very punctual. So, I don't want to hang on too long, but I do want to open up the line, open up the floor for folks in the comment section. If you do have any questions for myself or our guest tonight, Renee Hatcher, please, go ahead and post those in the comment section. We'll hang on the line for this few minutes delay, or this minute delay, I think it is, that the video transmits. So if you have questions, please post it in the comments. We want to make sure that, we have covered all of the things that are really critical to you in terms of understanding cooperation, understanding collectivism, and understanding where we are going in terms of all of the forms of capital we have to maximize and grow our community. So any comments, please post them in the questions. Well, questions in the comments. There we go. And I want to shout out, Sister Safia there. I see you. Right on, Black Power. Sister Safia of Your Bountiful Harvest, and someone who is a family that is tremendously steeped in the history of collectivism. So we really appreciate the Rashid tribe there. And Black Power to Sister Tequila Shabazz, the founder of the Bridge Embassy for Black America, where we are building and protecting Black. So, are there any questions out there? Any questions, any comments, anything that anyone needs to express? And that's why this timer is always beneficial, because now that it's run out, I don't know exactly where this delay is at in terms of what I'm looking at on the screen. Oh, okay. We've got a question here from Antoine Belmer. Would the first step in thinking about starting a collective be a need? So I don't see many Black businesses on my side of town. So yes, what's sort of the first step in possibly defining, what the need is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think that in looking at both the historical account and taking a survey of cooperatives that currently exist, right, the ones that are the most successful, and businesses generally, right, is when they actually feel a need or a gap. Right. And also sometimes it's in the delivery of it. Maybe it provides access to a whole lot more folks in terms of the price point or whatever that looks like. But I do think that kind of approach where you're first like taking a survey of what the actual needs are is the right way to go. conversely, for example, like a lot of the clients that I work with might go to a small business development center and get market research about, well, I want to do this, and let me take a survey of the kinds of businesses that currently do this. And there's a lot, actually, there's a more or less, if you actually dig into the research on a lot of this, the market research is not all that effective. It's one, the way in which it's put together, and the folks that actually gather that kind of research take a lot of assumptions in actually putting it together. And so what I would say is, in some ways, yeah, you have a leg up if you already have a sense what the needs and the gaps are in your community. And I think that's an ideal way to actually go about, specifically for cooperative development, because not only are you creating the business, but you're actually providing something that otherwise would not be accessible to the folks in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So I don't see any other questions posted, and we are 7 minutes over. And because I am a very punctual person, I want to make sure that I do, go ahead and close out the segment. I can promise this first segment went 45 minutes. This one went, about 68. I can promise this segment will not grow. We are trying to keep it very succinct and very to the point. And ultimately, we want it to be just a nibble, just a nibble. If you bite on it, then, you can go feast elsewhere, and there are lots of resources that are posted for you to feast on. So make sure you are looking out for up. Mama Sophia came in with the save. So yes, before I pick up on Mama Sophia's question, just make sure that you are looking out for those posts that are in the group, how we cooperate. So that's kind of just extending on Dr. Nimbar's work, and just saying these are the different ways that we are already cooperating in society at the present. These are ways that we've cooperated in the past, and this is what cooperation looks like. This is what the collective activity that we have been able to engage and looks like. So, every time when we get to this space of, Ujamaa and Ujamaa doing Kwanzaa, and we're talking about this collective work and responsibility, and we're talking about cooperative economics, we don't necessarily just have to draw on the history. We got the present right now. We got Tight Shift. We got Detroit, Black Community Food Security Network. We have present day examples that we can touch upon. We've got Mandela, Food Cooperative in Oakland. So we have present day examples that we can touch upon, we can draw upon, that will actually help us to shift forward and remember, Sankofa, go back and come get it. To get these examples, that existed in the past, that exist in the present, and are ways that we have always organized our communities. So Mama Safia, posed the question: any advice to for-profit businesses that want to convert to a co-op? I'm just going to frame Mama Safia's question, noting that Your Bountiful Harvest is an urban farm enterprise that Mama Safia started, and she has farmed up to, I think, a quarter acre. She could have farmed larger. So, if I'm misreading your work, Mama Safia, please forgive me. But, she does know how to, farm a lot of land. So, she can do crop planting for much larger spaces. Plug for Mama Safia. But yes, for-profit
Yeah,
businesses.
really quickly. So the other thing I would probably should be mentioning is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I direct a legal clinic that provides free legal support to small businesses, nonprofits, but really focusing on cooperative development and solidarity economy enterprises. So we will be taking on new clients soon. And essentially what in terms of a for-profit business that wants to convert to a co-op, right, there might be a number of different steps for that. So there are ways in which we can actually change the legal structure that might make more sense to convert into a co-op. But then a lot of what it is really rethinking the internal governance of that business, right? Thinking about what kind of cooperative is it going to be? Is it going to be a consumer cooperative where, for example, the folks who actually might be buying the produce from the venture they're going to be members, or is it going to be a workers co-op? And we can talk through the different options, or sometimes it's even what we refer to as a hybrid or a multi-stake holder co-op, in which both consumers and workers can be the owners of that. And so I would just say, and I'll be sure to post in the group, a link to just information about our services. Again, all of our services are free. We provide legal support to cooperatives and other kind of solidarity economy enterprises, and we'll be taking on new clients soon.
All right. All right. Ideally, that answers your question, Mama Safia. And, since I do not see any more questions in the group that posted, we are going to go ahead and close this broadcast at 12 minutes past that 1 hour mark. So yes, we are somewhat on time. So thank you very much for appearing on the Ujamaa Hour tonight, Renee. We really appreciate your presence. We appreciate your work. And I appreciate your cooperation in this matter. And so look forward to working with you in the future and onward and forward.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate this.
All right. Good evening, sis.